Okay, Peter Marston is a professor of communication studies at Cal State Northridge. He got his Ph.D. from USC in 1987. He is the recipient of the National Communication Association's Karl Wallace Award for Outstanding Rhetorical Scholarship. His article in the last issue of Skeptical Inquirer, the September-October issue, is called The Rhetoric of Extraordinary Claims. We have a few copies on sale in the lobby. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Peter Marston.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I should say that I am a college professor, so I have a great deal of experience speaking with people who have no interest whatsoever in the subject matter. And only listen out of a sense of self-survival. But, so this will pose new opportunities, and I fear new challenges, speaking to people who might be interested in what I have to say. I'd like to thank the Center for Inquiry for having me, and for Bob inviting me and Jim introducing me. Thank you very much for that. My basic thesis is this, is that I'm going to discuss the ways in which the skeptical movement is typically very committed, and appropriately so, to traditional critical thinking approaches to looking at discourse advancing extraordinary claims. But that rhetorical study could complement and improve our ability to diffuse such discourse. And there's something to say that in a lot of skeptical articles, you will find rhetorical things mentioned in passing. In fact, many of the examples I'm going to be giving here will be familiar to you. That's why I chose them that way. But very rarely is the rhetorical aspect of discourse advancing extraordinary claims examined in any sort of systematic way, or a way that makes sure we don't miss rhetorical appeals. And what Jim had to say about the science being very strong on one side, and the skeptical movement not getting much traction in the persuasive side, I think part of the problem with that is that we understand why the arguments are wrong, but we don't understand why the arguments are appealing. And if we don't understand why wrong arguments are appealing, and that's been the case from the beginning of human discourse, it's difficult for us to engage in that discussion. Simply pointing out that they're wrong is typically sufficient. It's typically not sufficient to make any progress in terms of persuading people. So that's sort of my thesis. By the way, I am by nature a Socratic teacher and ill-suited to talks. So if you have any questions at any point, please feel free to raise your hand, and I will try to take those as we go along. My comments here are going to be split basically into three different sections. I'm going to operate under the assumption that at least some of us here don't have a very extensive background in the study of rhetoric or rhetorical theory, so I'm going to sort of just introduce that area of subject matter. Then I'm sort of going to go through and bullet point some of the points I made in the article that was recently published in Skeptical Inquirer. And then in the third section, I'm going to talk a little bit about Aristotle's conception of the relationship between epistemology and rhetoric. I think most people in philosophy, logic, and in the skeptical movement believe that only logic and science have an epistemological function. I want to just introduce the ways in which Aristotle thought that rhetoric had an epistemic function as well, and sort of lay that out for you. All sound okay? Okay. So I want to start off by talking about just what rhetoric is. Well, clearly we're looking at the use of language. And I'm in the field of communication studies, and rhetoric is sort of a subset of that. But the first thing I want to say is that logic, science, critical thinking all bear a very different relationship between looking at language, as does any of the communication studies, and rhetorical theory specifically. As a rule, logic, science, and critical thinking are looking at the relationship between statements and conditions in the world. Okay, so we're trying to find what are the best ways for statements, language, physical laws and physics, to represent actual conditions in the world. And by the way, every viable rhetorical theorist thinks that's possible, and I think that's possible. But there's another relationship that's important in any sort of social enterprise, and that is the relationship not between statements and the world, but the relationships between statements and human beings, right? The relationships that statements and language creates between people. Some of you may have read Robert Park's book, Voodoo Science. He talks in there about alternative medicine. What it really is a subculture. It's a group of people who relate to one another through rhetorical discourse rather than a particular principled approach to science that is any sort of alternative. They're really sort of a subculture, a group of people who form relationship through this particular type of terminology. And there's a little bit about that discussed in the article that I wrote that I'm not going to talk about here. So that's the difference between logic, science, and critical thinking on one side and communication on the other hand. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what rhetoric has to do with communication, and I usually find the easiest way to do this is to talk about the four purposes of communication, why human beings communicate, and then connect that to what rhetoric studies from among those purposes. Whenever I ask my students, why do people communicate? The first answer is always, we communicate to move information from one mind into another. And that's the transmission function of communication. The people communicate in order to transmit information. And the transmissional abilities of communication are indeed remarkable. I'm sure most of you know that if a small airplane is flying and a pilot has a heart attack or is otherwise incapacitated, they can take another person on the plane and just through language typically get them to land the plane safely. That's where the expression talking someone down comes from. And it's truly remarkable. Some of you may remember about the scientist who was in Antarctica and needed to perform a surgical procedure. And they told her how to perform a surgical procedure over the radio. And it was successfully performed. So that's amazing. Now, the transmissional effects of communication are not studied until really late in the history of communication studies. They start being studied in the mid-1900s. The applications are all military, where we're trying to find out how to improve the efficiency of communication. The basic finding of this course of study is that we need redundancy to compensate for noise. So we need the same message embedded in any number of ways in a communique so that if there's distortion or loss or static, people can still understand it. And that's called information theory. Now, the second purpose of communication is people communicate to express themselves. That is, to take some internal subjective state and manifest it into the world. We do this in art, we do this in music, we do this in theater, we do this in clothing, we do this broadly in culture. And so cultural studies and performance studies are the areas in communication that take a look at the expressive function of communication. That starts about 1915, the study of that. The third purpose of communication is understanding. Now, understanding is different than transmission. In transmission, we're understanding the message. In understanding, we're understanding the other person. And of course, the study of understanding starts with the field of hermeneutics and trying to understand Scripture. How were people very early on in both the Judaic and the Christian tradition, how are they going to understand this, as we all know, is a very difficult text to understand. The goal not being to know what the message is, but to sort of, as Descartes wrote in Discourse on Methods, to see through the eyes of God and sort of understand what God's intent or purpose and plans are. That's studied, as I said, in the field of hermeneutics, which is also an ancient study. But the primary reason people communicate is to cooperate. People communicate to coordinate actions. So here we're coming up on the midterm elections, all these ads about, family and work and rights and all this stuff. There's no real sense that we need to understand it the way that the candidates do. They just want us to cooperate with them by voting for them. And so this notion of fidelity and transmission or understanding of humans really goes out the window. The point is to cooperate. And that's what rhetoric is the study of. Rhetoric is the study of the use of language in human cooperation. If you only had one word, persuasion would be a good word, but persuasion implies an intentionality, a purpose, a design that is really not necessary. Almost all spontaneous communication is designed to get other people to cooperate with us, to act jointly with us. okay? So that's sort of understanding rhetorical theory like from the top down. Language, communication, rhetoric, trying to contextualize it in its largest sort of picture. The second way I want to get at what rhetoric is to talk about some of the concepts that fall under rhetorical theory. So now we're at the scope here of rhetorical theory. And I want to say that rhetoric is not susceptible to analytic definition. It's a different type of thing. Like things in geometry, things in physics are susceptible to what we call analytic definitions. That means you can come up with a definition that is just what it is and it's the only definition you need. So a triangle is a planar figure with three sides where the interior angles sum to 180 degrees. That's it. You're never going to need another definition of a triangle. In physics, force is mass times acceleration. That's it. We're good there. But rhetoric is a term more like jazz, or more like love, or more like justice, in that it's grounded in such human activity that is sufficiently ambiguous and rich that a single definition is probably not going to work. We're going to talk about a couple good ones here. But I generally try to get my students to approach rhetorical theory in terms of the four central tenets of rhetorical theory, regardless of your definition, regardless of your theory, and there are probably about 50 viable rhetorical theories from Aristotle up to Jean Baudrillard. And all of them share these four tenets. So this is an easy way to get into rhetoric in a way that's parsimonious, non-threatening, and doesn't require flashcards. The first central tenet of rhetorical theory is that rhetoric is advisory. That is, the way rhetoric works is rhetorical communication recommends a viewpoint, it recommends an attitude, it recommends a value, it recommends a behavior. And this typically happens always. Whenever people speak, there's an implicit exhortation to agree with me, to act with me, to believe me. And so when you speak, you're a transmitter of viewpoints, beliefs, attitudes, values. Richard Weaver was a rhetorical theorist from the 1950s, and he said it this way, and I think it's very clear. He said, language is sermonic. We are all of us preachers in some public or private capacity. We have no sooner uttered words than we have invited others to see the world, or some small part of it, in the way that we do. And that's the nature of, that's the rhetorical aspect of communication. When you speak, you invite others to share your viewpoint. And language is sermonic, is just a poetic way of saying rhetoric is advisory. It's the same idea. The second feature of rhetorical discourse is that it's addressed. That when you take a look at a piece of rhetorical discourse, you can tell who would adhere to it. You can tell who it's addressed to. Because the choices we make in framing discourse are driven in part by our viewpoint of the other person. I started off this talk by saying I usually speak to people of little interest in the subject matter. Here I have a different conception of an audience, and my choices are done accordingly. We can tell by the choices that Dr. King made in the I Have a Dream speech that he's addressing idealists. We can tell by the choices Abraham Lincoln made in the Gettysburg Address that he's addressing people who are in it for the long haul, people who aren't concerned about the loss in the 6-hour battle at Gettysburg, but are concerned about what's going to be ahead of us generations from now. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I get into the central point of the talk. Chaim Perlman, a Belgian philosopher, put it this way. He says, rhetoric is like a feast. It's prepared for the guests, not the cooks. Indeed, it is the audience that plays the greatest role in determining the quality of rhetoric that is presented to it. And for me, and I think many of us in the skeptical community, one of the most discouraging things about the prevalence and the rise in paranormal, pseudo-scientific, conspiracy theory belief, all the topics we're familiar with, is that what it indicates is not just a change in viewpoint, but a devolution of audiences who are capable of handling reason and argument in a way. Those arguments succeed because the audiences are underprepared to deal with reason, evidence, and values. So they're just symptoms of a decrease in quality in the audience. I don't know if you guys, I often tell my students to go to YouTube and watch the Nixon-Kennedy debates. and then to watch the either Bush Kerry or Obama Romney, and you can just see how far the level of discourse has fallen. No matter what you think of Kennedy or Nixon, that is one smart debate. Those are smart, informed guys who are arguing clearly. And now we see people just sort of embodying cultural stereotypes and acting in a way that you would want to like them. And it's the same reason that paranormal or extraordinary discourse continues to prevail and even grow. The third central tenet of rhetorical theory is that rhetoric is situational. Now, most people take this to mean it happens in a context, but that's really not what it means. It means that rhetoric is addressed not only to people, but to problems. People speak because they wish something were other than the way it is. So the civil rights, the I Have a Dream speech is directed to the fact that there's a problem. And Dr. King wants us to pass the Civil Rights Act. Abraham Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address is deeply concerned that if we fall out of the war, America will forever be a divided and weaker country. And these are all problems. I'm going to give two quotes here from Lloyd Bitzer, who is most associated with this tenet. He defined rhetoric this way: rhetoric is a mode of altering reality, not by the direct application of energy to objects, but by the creation of discourse which mediates thought and action. So rhetoric is a way of changing the world. I'm just going to give a very personal example of this. My mom was a lifetime smoker, and she passed away from emphysema. And her doctors were trying to treat her through the direct application of energy to objects. That is, they were giving her pulmonary therapy, they were doing surgical techniques, they were giving her medication to reduce the viscosity and flow of mucus into her lungs, and all that's an appropriate way to treat emphysema. Me and my brother and my sister were trying to treat her emphysema by getting her to quit smoking, by using discourse to mediate thought and action. We did succeed, but not till it was too late to have much of an effect on her. But when speakers are trying to change people's minds, that's a realistic way of changing the world, just as we're trying to do here as skeptics in advancing more rationalist positions. Bitzer, at the very end of his article, says a lovely thing, too, about rhetoric. He says, in a perfect world, there might be communication, but there would be no rhetoric. Right? If there were no problems, we might be able to communicate, but there'd be no rhetoric, because rhetoric is about getting something different at the end than you had at the beginning. Fortunately, the need for things to be different flows eternally and is perennially reborn, so there's no shortage of that. And the last central tenet of rhetoric is that rhetorical discourse is stylized. A lot of people think this means each speaker has their own style or each writer has his own style, and that's not really what we mean. What we mean is that rhetoric is grounded in creative choices. I often ask my students, what are speeches made of? Or what are essays made of? And the answer is always words, arguments, paragraphs, fonts. But that's not the answer. Speeches and essays are made of choices. The choice to speak or to write or not to speak or to write. The choice to speak of this and not that. The choice to take this position and not that position. The choice to advance these arguments and not those arguments. The choice to put it in this language and not that language. Right? Those are all choices. And if you want to understand rhetorical discourse, rather than following the sequence of words that are coming at you, is to reverse engineer the series of choices that the rhetor is making. Because rhetoric is advisory because the rhetor makes a choice, he wants you to make the same choice. That's the simplest model of how rhetorical discourse works. Walter Fisher put it this way when he talked about rhetorical discourse as stylized. He says that rhetoric proceeds from an act of creative insight, reveals inventiveness of mind and imagination, and demonstrates the capacity to achieve order, unity, coherence, and force in expression. And so those are the four central tenets of rhetorical theory. They're not intended to be mutually exclusive or atomistic. One implies the other. If we're advising, we must be advising someone about something, and you can only advise if you have choices, right? So all these things sort of follow from one another. So that's just a little introduction to what rhetoric is, and hopefully it'll be useful in providing context to my comments right now, which are about the rhetoric of extraordinary claim. And I use extraordinary claim as an easy umbrella to connect the pseudo-scientific, the paranormal, conspiracy theory, all the various other types of things, or the denialism, all the other sort of stuff we're dealing with, when claims that are made that are extraordinary. And of course, this follows from Carl Sagan's original use of that expression. Are there any questions, by the way? We okay so far? Yeah? Okay. So I first want to talk about the relation. I'm sorry, I'm receiving a transmission from a spaceship. I've been called home. I'll have to leave. Have to leave at the moment. In talking about the rhetoric of extraordinary claim, I want to start off by talking about the relationship between rhetorical analysis and traditional critical thinking approaches. And you could probably deduce this from my earlier comments about logic, science, and rhetoric. And that is this. Traditional critical thinking approaches focus on the strength of arguments. Are the arguments strong? Are the arguments weak? Sometimes you'll hear people use the word valid and invalid. Generally, that's sort of arcane language. Logic is developed by Aristotle and refined by Descartes, wanted to frame everything in terms of being valid or invalid. And this created no middle ground of strength and weakness. And so generally we use the word strong and weak to talk about the strength of arguments. But rhetorical analysis focuses not on the strength of arguments, but on the appeal of arguments. What is it in an argument that is working for an audience? And you can't get rid of that. Even if one says, I'm not going to be appealing, I'm going to be a straight-talking, logical rationalist, that's going to be appealing to straight-talking, logical rationalists, right? So whatever you do, there's appeal in addition to strength. Now, I also want to point out that critical thinking approaches and rhetorical approaches are not mutually exclusive. Very often, the strength of an argument is part of its appeal. Ideally, in a perfect world, the strength of an argument would be the primary appeal of an argument. But if you look at discourse today, especially discourse advancing extraordinary claims, you'll see that clearly the discourse is appealing and prevailing when the arguments are not particularly strong. So there must be other aspects of appeal other than the strength of the argument. The types of language that people use in extraordinary discourse, the type of commonplaces, that means like shared facts, stories, anecdotes, values, the temporal progression of an argument, the tone of voice or expression that people use, the underlying narrative or myth that is supported. Certainly one of the reasons alien theology is so appealing is the same reason that the Christian story is so appealing. It's a prodigal son story, and people find those stories appealing. We're waiting for the return of someone who will save us. That's part of human culture since the beginning of storytelling. And people find those stories appealing, even though they're not well-founded. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Yeah, well, absolutely. Yeah, well, I'm teaching this class right now called Communication and Death, and we're talking about the ways in which our conceptions of death can strain. And we were talking about traditional Christian notions of the afterlife are in fact not souls ascending to heaven. I'm sure some of you know this, but it was the bodily resurrection. That when Jesus came back after the second coming, God would somehow reform the bodies from the graves. And we were talking about how the Jewish people have it even worse because they got to wait for the Messiah first, and then they got to wait for the second coming and the resurrection. So you're right, 2,000 years is a lot of waiting. And with ancient astronauts, of course, the waiting is even longer. I told you I'd start off with a definition of rhetoric that I think is useful. This is Aristotle's, and it's the historically most important. Aristotle wrote the Rhetoric in about 8 BC. He actually didn't write it. It's just his lecture notes on rhetoric that his students compiled. But here's his definition of rhetoric. Rhetoric is the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. So one of the hallmarks of rhetorical discourse is that resources vary from situation to situation. We can imagine this. If one is a prosecuting attorney or a defense attorney, what you can use in your arguments depends upon the particular case. And you can't use the same arguments in every situation. And we're going to return to this at the very end of it. But that's what rhetoric is, the means of persuasion. What can we do to appeal to other people? And for Aristotle, there were 4 canons of rhetoric, that is 4 basic types of rhetorical appeals. The first is invention. Invention is the material of a speech, the content, its subject matter. What material can you bring to bear to advance your particular position? And for Aristotle, there were 3 different types of appeals, 3 different modes of proof. The first one we're not going to say much about because it's what critical thinking people do, and that is logos. Logos is the study of the logical structure of an argument. And this is, of course, what traditional critical thinking people do best. They analyze and point out the weaknesses and the flaws in arguments logically. So if we want to talk about where critical thinking approaches and rhetorical approaches sort of map onto one another or meet up, it's really in this concept of logos, that part of an argument is its logical appeal. But he talks about 2 other modes of proof that are occasionally discussed in skeptical critiques, but rarely systematically. The first is ethos. Ethos consists of ethical appeals. What are the qualities of values that are brought to bear in the discourse? The Gettysburg Address, for example, most people are familiar with it. It's only 2 paragraphs long. It's very short, so if you're not familiar with it, you can read it quickly. There is an argument there, but the argument isn't what's appealing about the discourse. What's appealing about the discourse are the quality of the values that Lincoln brings to bear on his position. He notes that his argument is aligned with liberty, equality, commitment to purpose. And if you want to know how the speech works, that's how it works. Not that there isn't a claim and a reason in an argument, but the ethical appeal is extremely important there. I pointed out in the article that I wrote that in the analysis of discourse advancing extraordinary claims, skeptics typically evoke the criteria of scientific adequacy. Well, that's an ethical critique, as those criteria aren't facts, they're values. And we're concerned about the values that people who are advancing extraordinary claims are bringing to bear on the discourse, and our concern is that the values are not sufficiently high, that the values are in fact often base. Anyway, those are ethical appeals. This third type of appeal are pathos, emotional appeals. Now, most critical thinkers will be aware of the appeal to emotion as just a type of logical fallacy, as something that makes an argument just wrong. But Aristotle believed that emotional appeals are rhetorically important, that you have to put an audience in a frame of mind for them to be open to a reason. That is, Aristotle's definition of man, I don't know if any of you know it, was man was the rational animal. That means we're rational, but it also means we're still animals. And we have emotional states. And we have to put our audience into an emotional state that will make them receptive to our arguments. The example I like to use on this is from a scientific piece of discourse, so I hope it's something you'll be open to. But I don't know if you're familiar with On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Bodies by Copernicus, but it starts with nearly a 2-page dedication and benediction to Pope Paul III. And it's actually quite bootlicking or posterior sniffing in our contemporary lexicon. But rhetorically, it's brilliant, because his argument without that appeal to humility would appear arrogant and turn people off. And people wouldn't be receptive to an argument about a change in the positions of the planets, not a change in our view of the position of the planets, by pretty strong arguments. But this emotional appeal at the beginning sets up the argument perfectly. Although I will note that if you go online or if you get the bargain price edition at Barnes & Noble, you'll find that this benediction has been excised, which is also sort of a curious editorial shift. But I've very little doubt that more heads would have rolled if Copernicus hadn't begun his On the Revolutions of Heavenly Bodies with this appeal to humility. Now, in the rhetoric of extraordinary claim, we find typically seances are front-loaded with appeals to affiliative emotions, connections with families. Sometimes seances are front-loaded with appeals to grief. And you have to get people in a seance open to the poor arguments by getting them in a state of mind where they're receptive to this. And if a seance merely started with the chicanery, they would be far less effective than opening with this type of emotional appeal. Now, the second canon of rhetoric for Aristotle is arrangement. Arrangement has to do with the organization of an argument. Like, how do we proceed temporally? Do we put the strongest argument first? This is what's called the primacy effect. If we want to put our strongest argument last, that's called the recency effect. There's certainly some art and an intuition about which may work best, but there are also rules and principles that Aristotle and other rhetorical theorists teach for when you would make one choice instead of another. In the I Have a Dream speech, I think there's very little doubt that a big part of the appeal of the speech is that he starts by talking about the problem and then moves into talking about the solution, ending with a positively ecstatic description of a utopia that the audience finds appealing. Here are a couple examples from a discourse that advance extraordinary claims. In cold reading, the sequence of topics and questions from general to specific is central to the rhetorical efficacy of the reading. Cold reading could not work without the order of questioning that they go through and the ordering of topics that they talk about. Sequence is extremely important to how that works. In infomercials promoting miracle diets or supplements, they typically place extensive testimonials before they give any explanation of the product or how it works or the animations of the cells attacking each other and stuff like that. And the putting testimonials at the front is extremely important to the argument working, because we're not interpreting the testimonials in terms of the science. We're interpreting the science in terms of the testimonial. And from a rhetorical strategic viewpoint, that's a very important thing to do. The third canon of rhetoric for Aristotle is style, the type of linguistic expression used. The type of language you use to put forth any point is pivotal in getting an audience to accept it. I always tell my students that no one would remember the I Have a Dream speech today if it had been called I Have an Idea. Although the point of the speech is he has an idea. But idea doesn't resonate with anybody. Dream resonates with idealists. I don't think we would remember the Gettysburg Address if it started off 87 years ago. Starting off 87 years ago is central to his point, which is, I don't want you to think in terms of years. I want you to think in terms of generations. Because the whole problem with the Gettysburg Address, the rhetorical problem that Lincoln faced, was that we had so many dead in such a short period of time, 20 to 30,000 people killed in like 6 hours, so much blood in the ground that they bring in swamp pumps to get the blood out of the ground. And so what do you say about that? If you're thinking about that day, those hours, those deaths, you can't win. So he connects his argument not to years, but to generations. 87 years ago, that's forever. 80, that's 4 generations. My great-grandfather. And that style was essential to the success of his speech. Now, style is, of course, an essential element in most pseudo-scientific discourse, as even the most dubious claims seem more appealing veiled in scientific-sounding language. If we can sometimes find words that, like the power balance bracelets, field equilibrium, God, that sounds good. Got to get me some field equilibrium. Doesn't mean anything, but that would be an important part of the appeal of pseudo-scientific discourse. Now, the final canon of rhetoric for Aristotle is delivery. That's the ways in which we use our tone of voice, or we use gestures, or we go like that a lot, whatever it might be. A lot of discourse advancing extraordinary claims is, of course, written, and there's no delivery component to written discourse. But a lot of it is still oral, and a lot of what we see on TV. I'll start with the seance, though. Again, the intonations of a medium are very important. right? They can't say it in sort of a neutral voice. They have to take a very solemn tone, like, I'm getting a message. It's like, it wouldn't work. Okay, I got a message here. The deliberate delivery of those presenting themselves as medical experts in infomercials, or, I'm sure we're all concerned that our science channels are dominated by non-science discourse. In fact, anti-science discourse. And the ways in which they pose rhetorical questions as though they are scientifically really relevant. I remember once, this is many, many years ago, some of you may remember the show In Search Of, the Leonard Nimoy hosted show, and he was giving a show on these roads in the NASCAR plane in South America. And I remember him saying, these runways, these roads, could they have been used for vehicles without wheels? Vehicles you drag? I mean, if you don't have wheels, you don't need a road. But the way in which he presented the question made it sound like, it's for vehicles without wheels. Now, what does a rhetorical analysis do for a person who's interested in skeptical discourse? I think it's great, and I do a lot. I teach a class called the Rhetoric of Extraordinary Claim. I've been teaching it for 10 years at Cal State Northridge. And the students typically report that it's very liberating, that they're no longer suckers for all this sort of stuff. And we do a lot of critical thinking work. But a lot of what I find most successful is when you point out these rhetorical appeals, it dissuades, diffuses, doesn't debunk, because we're not talking about the logic of it, but it makes it clear, it shows the man behind the curtain, right? And it lets people know that if the sequence of questions in cold reading were different, it wouldn't work. Right? If the person running the seance spoke in a clipped Mike Tyson voice, it wouldn't work. When I talk to them about infomercials being essentially simulations of science shows, they say, wow, that's right. It's really sort of a staging of a fake science show. And that helps them put the discourse down and leave it. Now, I want to close today by talking a little bit about rhetoric and epistemology. This might be the most controversial material that I have in terms of this particular audience, because in my experience, most people in the skeptical community think that only logic and science and empiricism have any basis in creating knowledge. That wasn't Aristotle's viewpoint. I want to go back, though, by starting about Plato. Plato coined the term rhetoric, and it's a very troubled past. I'm sure most of you think rhetoric means BS. I mean, that's the most common understanding of what the word rhetoric means, and that's exactly how Plato coined the term. He coined the term as a pejorative. We had real philosophy. Does anyone know what he called that? He called real philosophy dialectic. That's what we call philosophy today, but he called it dialectic. And his parallel term was rhetoric, and dialectic dealt with truth, and rhetoric dealt with opinion. Dialectic dealt with certainty, rhetoric dealt with appearance. And Aristotle came along in the Rhetoric and rehabilitated rhetoric from Plato's critique. Not by saying that Plato was wrong, but by saying that Plato was incomplete. There is a type of knowledge that can be produced by science, but there's also a type of knowledge that is produced by rhetoric. In fact, Aristotle had 3 different realms of knowledge. The first realm of knowledge was science. This was the realm of certainty. If you could develop arguments where the mode of reasoning was certain, the classical syllogism is the best example. A is B, B is C, A is C. Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal. That's a certain form of deduction. There's no logical problem with it. And if you had that type of deduction, and your premises were also known with certainty, then you would have knowledge that was certain. And that's a high level of knowledge for Aristotle. Most people are troubled a little bit when they hear that for Aristotle the sciences were geometry, astronomy, and theology. He thought theology was a science, and his certain deduction about theology was fairly simple. All effects have causes. There must be a first cause. That was his argument for the existence of God. Now, it's not the Christian God, it's just the first cause God, but he thought theology could be established with certainty. In astronomy, his most famous deduction was the universe cannot be infinite because we see the heaven move, and the infinite body cannot move because it has no space to move into. Now, his error was the heavens weren't moving, we were, but his logic is unassailable, and that's what his view of what science was. Now, he also thought there was a second realm of knowledge. He also called this dialectic. This is the realm of probability. These are things that we can know not for certain, but with probability. His view of what was considered philosophy, I think, is a lot closer to what we see today. And he thought the two branches of philosophy were ethics and politics. And basically his position was this: murder is wrong, we can know, but we can't know it with certainty because there are exceptions. We can only know it with probability. Okay? So if you ask somebody, is murder wrong? I hope they will say, probably. And not maybe. Rhetoric deals in the realm of the contingent. The contingent is even a lower sort of realm. The contingent is the realm of something that depends upon something else. He, of course, thought that rhetoric was the realm of the contingent. He was particularly concerned with legal trials. In a legal trial, our knowledge can at best be contingent. It depends upon the evidence. Now, Aristotle's defense, here's a good example of the difference between a question that's probable and one that's contingent. Is murder wrong is a question that is in the realm of the possible, probable. Should we raise taxes is in the realm of the contingent, right? If somebody says, should we raise taxes, if their answer is probably yes or probably no, we know we're dealing with an ideologue and we're not dealing with someone who's in tune to the political reality, which is sometimes you should raise them and sometimes you should cut them. The person you ask, is murder wrong, if they say, well, it depends, well, that's not a very good answer either. Now, Aristotle's defense of the epistemic function of rhetoric is simple. It's easier to develop appealing arguments for claims that are true than for claims that are false. And therefore, over time, the truth will out. Right? The truth will out because it is easier to develop persuasive arguments on behalf of claims that are true than claims that are false. I do think that rhetoric can perform this sort of epistemic function in the type of discursive skirmishes and battles that we face in the skeptical movement here. When we see the polls are contingent, and we see the polls showing increased interest, adherence to, belief in paranormal claims, or we see our TV channels dominated by extraordinary discourse. We're not losing a battle of science. We're not even losing a battle of philosophy. We're losing a battle of rhetoric. And it would be useful for us to be able to develop rhetorical arguments that were willing to be contingent and not demanding to be certain. Thank you very much. Is that okay? Yeah.
Why is the human mind so eager to accept advertising and political rhetoric over facts? You know, I mean, to me, 80% of all advertising is a lie anyway. I mean, whoever says.
Well, that's a very generous estimate, in my opinion.
I mean, I like the Hispanics call advertising I forget the term, but it's basically just a lie, you know. And, yeah. But everybody believes it.
Well, I don't. I'm going to give two answers to that question. The first is I think that Aristotle and later theorists like Kenneth Burke are onto something when they say that you can't take the animal out of people, right? You can't take people's sense of threat and sense of self-esteem and sense of affiliation out of people, right? You can't turn people into mere fact-oriented beings. And if we did, there'd be problems with that too, because our emotions create lots of wonderful things in our lives as well. But I think the other half of the issue is that I think it's largely more of a cultural issue than it is a human mind issue. We don't live in a culture that values knowledge. We live in a culture that values image. We are a mediated culture. I often tell my students that teaching critical thinking and critical reading, I sometimes feel, is like teaching people how to shoe a horse. It's just from another time. Right? It's just from another place.
But the horse don't need shoes.
Find yourself a horse, you know. And by the way, I keep doing it, and I try to show them that critical thinking and critical reading is the best path to agency, to being able to have some control and autonomy in your own life, and to maintain your resources as best as possible. But you're swimming up tide. You know, when the average person, I go into my classes and I say, how many of you guys read a newspaper? The answer is always the same: none. Not one. I haven't had a student who received a newspaper in the last maybe 5 years. So I think it has more to do with that. In those periods of Western civilization where reason was important, reason was always a minority activity, right? And in large part, this was due to social oppression sort of processes. That if we got everybody reasonable, people wouldn't put up with the stuff at the lower end of the spectrum. But it was always highly valued. I've often said I think the problem in the education system has nothing to do with money or testing. We don't value education, right? It's not what we want. You know, I sometimes I tell my students, you know, my parents' generation, their epitaph will read, "We kept the world safe for democracy." And my generation's epitaph will be, "We built the supercomputer." And my students' epitaph will read, "We wore nice pants." Because that's the challenge. That's the challenge in their problem. You know, that's the problem that they face. What should I wear? Not how can I give history a pat on the fanny and send it in the right direction.
Mike's in the back.
Yeah. Right here. Going to what you were saying with the supercomputer, I kind of feel like that might be a lot of where we're going. We're not, we're relying so much, or I'm wondering if you think we're relying so much on the technology that's stopped us because that has so many answers that we're not taking the logic and the rationalization beyond that because we're just being fed the answers by the technology and therefore we don't have to think.
The history of communication has always been a move from what means of communication that are less efficient to more efficient. Okay? Even the very origins of speech, most anthropologists thought that singing was an elaborate form of speaking, that people spoke first and then sang. And singing is the continuation of a tone. So I say a word, if I hold the tone, next thing you know I'm singing. Now the belief is exactly the opposite. Neanderthals sang to communicate to each other, and speaking is a way of improving efficiency over singing by not holding the tone, by clipping it, right? And we've gotten to the point where everything, and the printing press makes it more efficient. We can have lots of books. It's not so time consuming. But what we've had now is that our communication is so efficient that we're just overrun with messages, and there's no time to process them or think about them. My students and I had this long debate about the whole Donald Sterling thing and the Clippers last spring. But when the Ray Rice thing happened, it was all over. No one cared about it, thought about it, or gave anything about it at all. The news cycle is so fast that people watch communication, receive messages for its ecstatic ability to just sort of roll over us and titillate us and interest us, and there's no time. I'm sure you've all seen a high-speed chase on TV. Yeah, okay, so you see the high-speed chase. You're talking to people who know nothing of what's going on, right? It's totally this model of what it might be, and when they find out what actually went on, no one ever hears it, right? Because everything needs to be very efficient. We need it now. And there's not much time for reflection or thought or critique. And of course, the shortness of the messages on Facebook or texting or tweeting, it doesn't invite engagement. People are taking turns. They're not conversing. Does that make sense to you? Yeah. Most people, especially younger people, they already know what they're going to say before the other person has even said what they're going to say, because that's how they've been encultured into communication.
Please take a moment to define cognitive dissonance.
Sure.
And would you agree that cognitive dissonance basically destroys the whole idea of rational argument if a person simply is totally unwilling to accept or rationalizes away their own opinion in the face of facts and scientific basis?
I'll be happy to talk about that. Cognitive dissonance was a theory developed by Leon Fessinger in the 1950s and 1960s. Basically what he said is that coherence among our beliefs is more important than the strength for any particular argument. So teachers have to think teachers are good, otherwise they're in trouble. And the impoverished have to think the poor are virtuous, because otherwise this is dissonant for them. Cognitive dissonance is the example that's typically given is like in the example of smoking. The smokers have to maintain cognitive dissonance because they're doing something that they know is unhealthy, but they can't stop, and it creates this dissonance for them that's very uncomfortable for them. I don't think you need to use cognitive dissonance to explain sort of the end of rationality. I think there are better concepts and theories that can do that. But I will say this. In an image-oriented, mediated-oriented society, people are more committed to their beliefs than to the way things are. Because their beliefs are part of an image they have to maintain. I gave a talk at Pasadena City College a few weeks ago. It was called Rhetoric, Reasoning, and Representing. And people have to represent like cultural stereotypes. And I just made the point that if you had an urban African-American guy who voted for Romney, he has some explaining to do, right? But the guy who voted for Obama doesn't. So what are you going to end up doing? Voting for Obama so you don't have to explain your thoughts, right? There's an incentive to not think. I tell my students, if I can tell what you're thinking by looking at you, you're not thinking. But typically, that's, if I see somebody's subcultural stuff, it's a little harder here, I'll tell you. But I can deduce like many of my students' beliefs. I use this example often. What do proponents and opponents of affirmative action share in common? I'm going to ask that again. What do proponents and opponents of affirmative action share in common? Where's their common ground? Neither has any interest in if it works. I mean, that's pretty fair, right? I mean, it's an article of faith for both sides. It's a representation of their standing and place in society, rather than a commitment to the way things actually are. I don't know, I don't have any idea if anyone has read the thing in Skeptical Inquirer that I wrote, but I end that piece with my definition of rhetoric. It's very poetic, so I don't usually use it to explain rhetoric, but it's this. There is a difference between the way things are and the way we talk about them. Rhetoric is the study of that difference. That's the rhetoric of something. The rhetoric of something is the spin, what you can do to make it appealing to people who otherwise wouldn't find it so. Yeah.
I have the...
Well, I guess we're passing around the microphone here.
Raise your hand if you have a question.
And Jim will bring you the mic, yeah.
So, kind of following on this, when taking evolution or climate change as an example, we're not really even talking about those things, because the people reading the reports, say in Washington Post this morning on the latest urge to do something about climate change, we're reading an interpretation of what the scientists are saying, but nobody's really reading the reports. I mean, you need to have significant education in evolutionary theory. You need to understand DNA and probability theory to really convince yourself, oh, this is a rational argument. So how do we deal with this, that the general population or, people
well,
in
there have been
general?
a couple articles in the Skeptical Inquirer over the last couple of years about this, and just speaking as a rhetorician, the main mistake is categorizing people as denialists. You just send them further into their foxhole, or somehow suggesting that people who have reservations or dismiss evolution are backwards. If you want to engage people, there has to be a place for them to talk. Right? That make sense, everybody? I talk about this in relation to Obama and his call for a national dialogue on race. National dialogue, and by the way, that has nothing to do with Obama. It could be anybody. But it'd be great to have a national dialogue on race. But the fact is that we don't let the racists talk. We can't have a dialogue until we start letting people express their viewpoints. And I'm no proponent of racist thought or that sort of position, but if you want to change people's minds, their opinions have to be at the table. And if their opinions aren't allowed at the table, you're not going to change any minds. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, so I'll put it this way. The primary rationale for the Democrats in our country is to protect us from the Republicans. And the primary rationale for the Republicans is to protect us from the Democrats. It's difficult to imagine a country failing when at any given point in time, half the people want it to fail. And obviously the figures aren't as great on the climate change or evolution and stuff, but the goal should be to move forward towards an understanding of the way things are rather than to vanquish an opponent. Yeah?
Yeah, could you compare rhetoric with propaganda?
Yeah. I think that propaganda, and that's what I meant when Plato, and I think most people today think of rhetoric as BS. I actually see propaganda as being closer to marketing than to rhetoric. Marketing is rhetoric without the values. Okay, right? So marketing is rhetoric that's done with no regard for what's best. Now, it is true. Can you use rhetoric and rhetorical tactics to persuade people about something you think isn't true? Yes, and that's propaganda.
It's called obvious.
Well, yeah. Well, and it's also characteristic of marketing, too, where they ask you, what would persuade you? And you tell them, they say, okay, we'll say that. You know, the sort of pandering that's in marketing, focus grouping. One of the hallmarks of contemporary discourse, too, is that traditionally the effect of a speech has come after the speech. Today, the effect of the speech comes before the speech. They won't give the speech until they know its effect. Okay, it's not exactly a bastion of bravery. Okay, but yeah, propaganda is definitely a type of rhetorical transaction. I will say this: I think often the word propaganda is used to describe rhetoric we disagree with, even when it's not propaganda. But there are clearly cases, of propaganda. I talked a little bit about the beginning, at the purposes communication. I talked about the field of hermeneutics. This hermeneutic scholar called Cledanius, a neo-Roman guy in the late Middle Ages, he came up with this principle called the principle of hermeneutic equity. And basically what he said is this, is that you need to give other people's discourse the same listen that you want people to give yours. And if you want to engage in successful, he's talking about understanding, but it goes as well for persuasion or cooperation. If you want people to cooperate, you have to give as charitable reading to their discourse as you would want for your own. And by the way, one can still prevail and persuade people better there, but we're interested in like often identifying with a part of a movement that is there to oppose a larger force or another force in society, and it's maybe more prudent to get in conversation with those people than to separate them and isolate them. Yeah. Oh.
Well, from what you said, I like the expression that now the younger generation is just concerned with what pants to wear. And I think this is through the centuries, was always the same. You're supposed to wear something what God's Son was telling you. Then when Moses was saying, then someone else was saying. And if you wanted to be accepted in a society, among the people that you are living it, you have to accept, you have to wear those pants.
Well, I think I'm generally in favor of pants. I'm like Voltaire, once for science, twice a pervert. But I've generally wear pants. I will say this though, is that it's a little different now. Is that traditionally, fashion was important, but it was still considered a token. And today it's considered self-expression. In other words, generally is that our choices in fashion were more culturally determined, and that I think you're right, you had to wear it this way. Now it's a very important choice because it's seen as a primary means of self-expression.
I think I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Thank you very much for the wonderful lecture on rhetoric.
You're too kind.
No, it was very, very interesting and educational. It sounds like what you're saying is that today we need to be more like what Michael Lakoff is talking about in ways you are framing things. Mm-hmm. So, I'm sorry, did I get the first name wrong? George. Yeah, don't think of an elephant. And in terms of us as secularists who may be trying to speak to people who have religious leanings, would you recommend we use rhetoric or propaganda?
Well, here's the problem with propaganda, is that the people will ultimately see that that's the case. Okay? I'm a little bit worried. Does everyone know about the Truth.com campaign? It's an anti-smoking campaign online. It's all propaganda. The science is like awful. I'm concerned that people will begin to realize that what they're saying isn't true, in the same way that a whole generation of people saw that the anti-marijuana propaganda wasn't true, and more progress would have been made if the discourse had been true. Now, the other thing I generally recommend in talking to religious people is to get them in territory where you can approach them. And if part of your persuading them is to get them to drop their faith or their belief, I don't think you're going to succeed, because that belief is like too central to the person, and you make your moves on the flanks and in the periphery. I'll tell you this story. This is an interesting story. My daughter came to me when she was 6 years old and said, "Dad, I heard there's no Santa Claus. Will you tell me the truth?" And I had a choice here. I can raise like sort of a girl who'll be kind of dark on the playground. You know, there's no Santa Claus. Or I can sort of like mislead her and live with that guilt for the rest of my life. But I took this approach. I said, well, you know, Charlotte, you know how I know more about just about everything than you do? Like I know more about physics and how the TV works and how to fix the toaster and what to do when the bathtub leaks and all this. I know all that. He goes, yeah, I know more about Santa Claus than you do. I'll tell you that. And I said, but here's the deal. I can tell you everything I know about Santa Claus, but you're going to have to pay for it. And she said, how am I going to pay for it? I said, well, you're not going to be able to be a kid anymore. And she said, well, when I'm ready to pay that, will you tell me? And I said I did. I said I would. And sure enough, she came back to me a few years later and said, Dad, I really know the truth now. I want to know. And I said, you're right. Your mom and I put the presents under the Christmas tree. And we do that. And she said, so there's no Santa Claus. And I said, well, Santa Claus isn't what you thought he was. And I said to her, at that point, Charlotte was sort of, exploring religious beliefs and was kind of vaguely a believer. And I said, you know how you go to school and you learn how the rains fall and how plants grow and how photosynthesis occurs and all that before you thought was just God, like doing magic and stuff? When you know how it works, does that mean you have to give up your conception of faith or God? I mean, Santa is what gets me and your mom to put those damn things under the tree. And so I'm using that as an example of having a lot of flanks and fringes to get Charlotte to move without having to go right for her core belief, which is just not accessible.
Because it's all about emotion and not about facts.
I wouldn't say it's all about emotion, but there are central things that most people will not let go of.
also about ethos and pathos at that point.
Yeah. I mean, I used to start my rhetorical theory class with two questions. If you don't believe in God, what evidence would convince you there was a God? If you do believe in God, what evidence would convince you there wasn't one? I stopped doing that because the question was just like too close to people. It was creating an anxious environment. So I changed it to, if you believe in aliens, what would convince you there are no aliens? And if you don't believe in aliens, what would convince you there are? I mean, it's the same question. But the problem was, I mean, right? That's the same question. But the problem was is that the God hypothesis was just so close to many people. You know, it's like the founding, you know, aspect of it, of many people, and the secular beliefs for others. And so I think I don't think that's where one starts the dialogue.
I'd like you talk just briefly about.
Turn that mic off.
To talk briefly about underlying preconditions for rhetoric of any kind to occur. Let me give you an example. There's a lot of YouTube videos that are from channels in Arab countries, like let's say Egypt and other countries, where someone will be interviewed and they will insinuate that maybe, you know, God doesn't really exist, and you know what's in the Quran is not really true, and then the guest gets taken off the show. So what level of freedom of speech or what is grounded in our traditions that say two people can have different opinions, and that's okay. Is there a threshold somewhere where rhetoric can occur, and below that threshold, there's no rhetoric of any kind?
I don't think there's a threshold, but there is a continuum of resources that one can have. In Existentialism and Human Emotions, Jean-Paul Sartre writes, "Man is condemned to be free." And I think there's some truth to that. But your degrees of freedom constrain your rhetorical tactics. And this gets related to the question we had just a second ago, is that one is free to use tactics that are imprudent, right, that will push the other person further away and drive them further into their foxhole. But I would advise people where if you're going to be taken off a TV for saying something like that, don't say something like that, and say something that moves things closer. We're never going to arrive at a position where everybody holds right beliefs. Is that clear? Is that fair enough to everybody? And the goal is not to, you know, arrive at that. And science is never going to explain everything. If it would, what would our kids do? I mean, it'd be worse than today, where they're asked to do so little. But I do think it changes the parameters of the experience. I use the example, of course, of Gandhi, who was at his most rhetorically effective in prison, where he had the least number of choices, but he made the choices wisely. So it sounds to me like the stories you're telling me there is that the stories, you know, that they're not using tactics wisely. And by the way, can any rhetor use whatever tactics he or she wants? No, all rhetors are wisely constrained by who they're talking to, and sometimes political concerns and sometimes economic concerns, and generally like time concerns. A friend of mine came here with me and she said, "So how long are you talking?" And I said, "I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 hours." She had filled with terror. And so all rhetors face constraints, and the goal is to work effectively within those constraints. But yes, the range of resources we have, you know, varies greatly depending upon the sort of situation we're in.
For purposes of our morale, could you give us an example where, with your skills in rhetoric, that if you had confronted somebody that was holding a false belief and that you were an adult, that you were able to at least move them or shake them in a more truthful direction?
Yeah, it happens all the time in my classes when I run into students who believe in astrology. And the first thing to say is not that astrology is hokum, although it is. The first question to ask is, well, tell me a little bit about your belief in astrology. What do you know about it? Why do you believe in this? And now I've just won 80% of the battle because I only have to confront them on what their particular bases of beliefs are. And most people try to go into debunking with what? With their objective is to what? Is to destroy the other person's viewpoint. Nobody wants their viewpoint destroyed. So you go in trying to shore up their viewpoint to something better. And I get most students at the end of the class thinking that they rejected all this stuff freely based upon information that was available to them, rather than encountering somebody who had a superior viewpoint and intellect and could somehow destroy them. But I think that's always the first question. When somebody has a viewpoint you think is wrong, ask them why they believe it. And they will do most of the work for you, because what's the answer? They don't have a very good reason to believe it. But no one's asked them. They've never entertained why I believe this. Some of you may be familiar with Schick and Vaughn's book, How to Think About Weird Things. It's a textbook I use in my class. It's the very first thing. The issue isn't the claim. The issue are the reasons. The claims are going to change. They're going to be things that we believe to be certain in science. I mean, germ theory is always going to be there, I'm sure, and other things. But are there going to be things we believe in science today that will be considered quaint 200 years from now? Yeah, it's not in the claims. It's in the reasons. And so I asked the student, why do you believe in astrology? What do you think even astrology is? And the fact is, they don't know. And when they realize they don't know, they're ready to be taught what it is. That's been my experience anyway. But I also have the advantage of like being the teacher and grading them. Don't grade
Two more questions.
Don't grade your friends.
What about focusing on the negative results, the irrational behavior caused by the irrational beliefs, and kind of backtracking and attacking the irrational belief that way?
That is an excellent, tactic, especially if you have facts in terms of the cost. In my Rhetoric of Extraordinary Claims class, I often talk about how much money America, and it's less now, by the way. How much money, I don't know if when the whole psychic hotline thing was very popular and all that stuff, the United States was spending more money on psychics than on prenatal care. And the kids, like that was moving to them because it connects them to other issues. Extraordinary discourse is the pornography of the mind. It won't kill you, it's what it displaces that's so dangerous. I'm surely some of you have enjoyed a Bigfoot TV show, haven't you? Come on, don't be fooling me. I saw your internet history. I know what you're looking at. But the problem isn't that you see it or you're entertained by it. It's just that you don't see anything on the other side. It displaces it. Like a hamburger, McDonald's won't kill you, but it displaces a good meal. Irrational thinking isn't the end of the world. It's just that people get so immersed in it, and it becomes their primary diet.
Like Fox News.
Well, yeah, or, it's definitely the proliferation of network channels where people can be exposed only to discourse they agree with is a problem across the whole spectrum everywhere you go. Okay. One more question?
Okay.
Yay. I don't mean that. I meant yay, a question from you, not yay, the last question. But we have come to my favorite part of the talk.
I can go with that. What do you do when you ask people why they believe what they believe and they give you a very vague answer? And
come back and talk to them in 2 days. I'm honestly, if someone doesn't have a very good explanation for why they're saying whatever they're saying, if you like jump on them right then and there, again, you're just going to drive them back. It's generally best to say, well, wow, that's let me give some thought to that and talk to them at some other later point. Or you can gently say, well, here's what I know about it. Not like, here's why you're wrong, but here's what I know about it. There's this great study on astrology done. I'm sure you guys all know the study where they had 1,000 participants, and sent out charts. They all had to send the people who were doing the study where they were born and when and all this other sort of very arcane stuff. And they sent out charts to the 1,000 people, and they asked them a series of questions. And the critical question in the study was, do you think this chart is sufficiently accurate to provide scientific evidence for astrology? And do you know what the response was on that question? 80% said they thought it was sufficiently accurate to provide scientific evidence for the astrology. But the great design of the study, all 1,000 people got the same chart. So what they proved was the Barnum hypothesis and not astrology. Now I tell that to people gently, here's what I know. Not here's why you're wrong. Here's what I know. And they go, wow, that's cool. That's a great study.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.